In this chapter, we are going to learn about the legal basis for public participation, the different forms of public participation, and what public participation entails. Public participation entails being able to take the initiative to express views with respect to a particular issue, having those views reach the particular decision makers, being actively consulted on a particular issue under consideration, obtaining information that would enable a person make a decision with respect to a particular matter, and influencing the outcome of decisions and actually making decisions. The origin of the principle of public participation can be drawn from Section 4J of the Constitution of Kenya Review Act of 2008, which had as one of its principles the review of the Constitution to ensure the full participation of the people in the management of public affairs. This aspect of public participation is actually recognized in Article 1 of the current Constitution, which provides that all sovereign power belongs to the people. It therefore follows that the enactment of the laws which draw their life from the Constitution would involve the people of Kenya in the process of enactment. The legal basis for public participation is found in various statutes which require the government to take into account the views of members of the public in making any decision or in enacting legislation. If we start with the Constitution, which is the supreme law of Kenya, the aspect of public participation is seen as one of the national values and principles under Article 10 of the Constitution. In particular, Articles 118 and 196 of the Constitution impose a requirement on Parliament and the county assemblies to facilitate public access and to carry out public participation in the legislative processes in the respective legislatures. In addition, Article 174C of the Constitution cites as one of the principles of devolution the participation of the people in the exercise of powers and in the making of the decisions that affect them. At the county assembly level, Article 196 of the Constitution imposes an obligation on the county assembly to conduct its proceedings in the open and to facilitate the engagement of the members of the public in the legislative affairs of the county assembly. Just like Parliament, the county assemblies are required to conduct their committee sittings in the open, and members of the public are actually allowed to attend these sittings. The exclusion of the members of the public or the media from such sittings can only be done in exceptional circumstances and with the approval of the respective speaker. With respect to public finance, Article 201 of the Constitution requires transparency, accountability, openness, and public participation in financial matters. This therefore means that the entities in the national government and in the county levels of government are required to put in place mechanisms that would allow for the engagement of members of the public in financial matters affecting them in the respective county. There are a number of international treaties and conventions to which Kenya is a party and which require Kenya to oblige with the principle of public participation. These treaties form part of the Kenyan law by virtue of Article 26 of the Constitution, save where such treaty would be in conflict with the Constitution. An example of this would be the African Charter for Popular Participation in Development and Transformation, which stresses the importance of public participation in matters governance by the respective governments. Undertaking effective public participation entails a number of steps. The first step includes defining the exact issues that are required to come up for public participation. It is important that these issues be concise, be clear, and be understandable to those people from whom views are required on that particular matter. This aspect also includes ensuring that the members of the public who are to be engaged at this point have access to the necessary information that would enable them make a decision with respect to the issue under consideration. The second step involves mapping out stakeholders. Some issues may be open for consideration by the members of the public generally, while in some instances, the relevant decision-making body may wish to target specific stakeholders, particularly those who would be involved in the implementation phase of that decision. This aspect recognizes the fact that there are specific stakeholders who would be important in the decision-making process at this point, as they would be either directly affected by that decision, would be involved in the implementation of that decision, and would therefore enable ownership of the decision that arises out of that public participation process. The third step entails determining the most appropriate entry point for public participation. This step is important as it may determine the success or failure of that public participation process. It is important to ensure that the most appropriate media is used at this point that would ensure the widest reach and the widest engagement of members of the public. Ensuring that a reasonable time frame is set for public participation is also important, as it would allow for adequate consideration of the issues at hand, it would allow for adequate engagement of the issues at hand, and it would also allow for engagement of as many stakeholders as possible, including the targeted stakeholders, prior to arriving at a decision. Too short a period would mean that the matters are considered either haphazardly or not adequate consideration is given to the issues at hand, and hence an uninformed decision arrived at. Too long a period would mean that if an issue required urgent intervention, then the delay may actually negatively impact those to be affected by that particular decision. Or the final step in public participation involves giving feedback to those from whom views were sought. It is important for people to know that their issues were taken into account prior to making the decision, as this would encourage ownership of the decision that is finally arrived at. When it comes to the various legislatures in Kenya, public participation may either take place at the initial stage of the legislative process or during public participation. At this stage, the various committees or even a sponsor of a bill may wish to engage with the relevant stakeholders for purposes of coming up with legislation to address a particular issue or obtaining views with respect to a legislative proposal that is currently underway and prior to publication. When conducting public participation with respect to a bill, notification or invitations to members of the public are usually done by way of a notice in the newspapers, and in most instances this notice will be found in the Standard and Nation newspaper. However, where a committee wishes to engage a specific stakeholder, they will extend an invitation to that stakeholder and have a meeting for purposes of deliberating on the issues at hand and obtaining the views from that particular stakeholder. When members of the public wish to submit their views with respect to an issue or a bill under consideration, it is very important that such persons be very concise and clear in their submissions, as you will find that in most instances, not much time will be given to such persons to make their full oral submissions. In such instances, it will be very important for such person, while making their oral submissions, to also submit their written submissions with respect to that particular matter. In the case of a bill, it's very important to set out the clause with which that particular person has an issue with, the issue they have with respect to that particular clause, and any recommendations for amendment of that clause, and of course a justification for that particular proposal. Without that, it will be very difficult for the committee to arrive at a decision on whether to adopt that particular proposal or not, particularly where the justification is not clear. The same pertains to a county assembly. Public participation is a must for all public entities. Where public entities have failed to adhere to the principle of public participation, the courts have been quick to set aside the decision or to void legislation that was made without involving the members of the public. In the Court of Appeal case of Mumo Matemu versus Trusted Society of Human Rights Alliance, and in the High Court decision of Susan Kaguro versus the Attorney General, the courts emphasized the need for the conduct of public participation as the Constitution required this in the decision-making processes of the respective public entities, and show that the courts are quick to set aside decisions arrived at through what the courts considered a flawed process. From this, we have been able to understand the legal basis for public participation. We have been able to understand the steps that are involved in public participation. We have been able to see how one can engage with Parliament and with the County Assembly in the public participation process. My name is Elizabeth Mohia, and I truly hope that you have